I start with my conversation with Norm Taylor, an expert in policing and public safety. I ask him why there are so many more stories of police brutality in the news than ever before.
Well, there are at least a couple of parts to that, Maggie. I think, certainly awareness has been heightened, as everyone can imagine, after the tragic death of George Floyd. Um, I'm not sure at this point whether the statistics would support there being more incidents or merely a greater awareness and a louder voice. Certainly, every one of these is an unspeakable tragedy. And I think, you know, it's important that they be front and center and that this conversation go on.
Yeah, DeAndre Campbell, Jamal Francique, Regis Korshinsky, Paquette, Chantel Moore, Rodney Levi. These are all people who have died in police presence during wellness checks or mental health wellness checks. Is there a system or a flaw in the system, Norm?
Well, yeah, let's get into that. Can I start though? I think it's important to be clear about what's not happening. Generally speaking, police officers are not setting out to target or to harm people, not setting out to harm Indigenous or Black people or people of color or any others that are overrepresented in the statistics. The vast majority of police officers would dearly love to complete their careers without ever drawing their weapon, let alone taking a life. And thankfully, this is still an exceedingly rare event in Canada, notwithstanding the incidents you just described. And it represents a small fraction of the millions of encounters. But something's definitely wrong in the numbers. The overrepresentation is something that police must examine deeply in themselves. But it's important to note that it's something that police cannot fix on their own, and I'd like to talk about that a bit.
Yeah, when you say it's a small amount, as we look at statistics from StatsCan and the census, there's a disproportionate amount of arrests and charges, incarcerations. You were part of a study by the by CTV that found that 100 people were mostly Black or Indigenous. When you look at the population relation, so when you say that Black people or Indigenous people are not being focused on, what's the problem? Is there a bias?
Well, there's a systemic problem. There's bias in everyone, and there's bias across the community. But let me cut it this way: the folks that you're describing don't trust the police, and more than that, they don't trust the system. The system has failed them. And I looked into public trust a couple of years ago. I led a research team. We discovered that trust across the whole human services system has deteriorated a lot. But we also discovered trust is reciprocal. And the communities that we're talking about don't trust the police or other parts of the system, largely because every day they're confronted with messages and experiences that tell them that the system doesn't trust them. And this is a huge problem. The overrepresentation that we see in crime stats is a result of a long litany of failures in education, early childhood development, economic opportunity, and this overrepresentation unfairly stigmatizes communities, and the result is perpetuated stereotyping and more fear. And so, too often, this shapes the differences in how everyday encounters occur, but it really shapes the difference in how the worst of those encounters might play out.
Explain that a little bit more. We have a story coming up of a young Black man that has been pulled over 20 times, and he would say it's because of his race. So how much of it is experience and how much of it is messages that we're getting in the news?
Well, I think, first of all, I think I don't think it's being overblown in the news. I think it's important that it be talked about. Change is necessary. But let me explain something that happens in the way police encounter individuals. The first step on what's known as the use of force approach or use of force continuum is officer presence. So, in other words, compliance is usually expected on that basis alone. So, but it can mean
Are you saying the community is not complying?
I'm saying that the interpretation of the encounter gets off on the wrong foot right off the bat. The example I used in talking with your executive producer is the absurdity of a police officer, say, confronting or accosting my wife, an older woman in the suburbs. Wouldn't happen. But even if it did, her lifelong conditioning would be likely to see it as innocent in its intentions and deserving of her compliance and cooperation. But when you're working with a community that already has trust problems and who have been abandoned or mistreated by the system, in many cases through their whole life, moms and dads who fear for the safety of their children from the actions of the police as much as they do from criminals, even officer presence is going to come across as a loaded weapon right from the outset. So the reaction gets off on the wrong foot. And very often we see this escalation occur as a result of this fractured trust. And when you add mental health to the situation, it's easy to see how de-escalation can become very distorted very quickly.
Interesting. I think trust has to be earned on both sides, for sure. Thank you so much, Norm Taylor, president of the Global Network for Community Safety. Thank you for joining us today, Norm.
Thank you, Maggie.